This is The Future Of, where experts share their vision of the future and how their work is helping shape it for the better. I'm David Carston. In a world increasingly interconnected by digital media and cultural exchanges, the phenomenon known as the Korean Wave, or Hallyu, has taken centre stage. But what propels the global fascination with Korean culture, from K-pop to cinema, and how does it shape cultural perceptions worldwide? Well, today I'm joined by Associate Professor of Korean Society and Culture at the School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry here at Curtin University, Jo Elfing Hwang. We explored the multifaceted dimensions of the Korean Wave, its impact on global entertainment, and the cultural bridges it builds across nations. Now, if you're keen to delve deeper into the intricacies of this cultural phenomenon, be sure to check out the resources in our show notes. This is a very wide-ranging question to start. I don't know how you're going to answer this in 1 hour. But first of all, the Korean Wave, or Hallyu, is a prominent global phenomenon today. But look, its origins and evolution are less known to many. Could you take us through those early days of the Korean Wave? How did it begin? And what were the key factors that contributed to the rise and the spread of Korean pop culture around the world?
Yeah, well, it was a bit of a slow process to start off with. So, of course, Korean culture wasn't exactly well known to start off with. So if we go back to the ancient history of 1990s, Korea had pop culture and, of course, had come through, if you know anything about Korea's history, it just come through this sort of political dictatorship period from 60s to 80s where there was a lot of censorship on what you could say, and pop culture tended to be quite calm and more focused on sort of romantic kind of trends and so forth. But from 1992 onwards, when there was this kind of democratization of Korea, that's where the government started really thinking about maybe culture could become one of those things that we could. So there was a new policy of globalization that the president then, Kim Yong-sam, called 세계화, so globalization policy. So with that, there was this idea that Korea was going to become a cinema superpower. And so they put a lot of effort into enhancing cinema. But at this point, there was nothing to do with music, really.
So you're telling me it was actually government motivated?
Well, yes and no. So part of it was about democratization movement. So you could suddenly, in 1992, there was the first election where you could, first the democratically elected president, and then suddenly there was no censorship to really worry about. So a lot of artists in Korea domestically started sort of experimenting with things, and there was hip-hop came big time to Korea, and there were some younger artists who started then experimenting with hip-hop. So Sodaeji and the Boys was the first band that really hit it big in 1994, and they came to this live program, and they sang this song called 난 알아요, I Know, which is about kind of teenage angst and how parents are so unfair and school is so hard and all of this stuff. And all the judges on that program, they absolutely hated it. You can still watch it on YouTube if you want to look it up. And the audiences went wild. And suddenly Sodaeji and Boys became this massive kind of like little Korean Beatles mania. And that was the sort of first time when pop music became, or a band became, a kind of fan phenomenon. But that was just domestic at that point. So this is early 1990s.
But the thing was, it was embraced locally first and foremost, which is, I guess, very different to, our cultural context, where we tend to look outward and perhaps don't support our local artists perhaps to the same extent when they're starting out. In South Korea, bang, it was embraced from the outset.
Yeah, well, it was a youth phenomenon. So it was a youth that all the parents were really worried about this, and there were all sorts of when Sodaeji and Boys became really big by 1997, when they then finally disbanded as well. There were all sorts of conspiracy theories that it was kind of, there was sort of satanic influences, and, if you played it backwards and all this kind of thing, you could hear secret messages, because why else would all these young people get so excited about this thing? But it was a really big phenomenon at that point. And then, of course, at this point, the government is really not in the picture in that, there was a push to push Korean films, but auteur films, sort of slow-moving, amazing films that would sort of win prizes in Cannes and things like that. But not so much about blockbusters or TV series. These were very much focused on Korean domestic audiences, as were kind of mainstream music as well. Because remember, at this point, you could have maybe LPs and then cassette players and things. So you don't have social media yet at this point. So no one was really expecting there to be this big international interest in Korean music. And when I was living in Korea in 1990s, no one would have known the people I listened to, overseas. So it wasn't really a thing.
You were so cool, weren't you? You were very cutting edge.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but it was very cool music. And, once you had to learn Korean. There were not really very many English sort of lyrics or anything. And it was only until sort of towards the end of 1990s. So, you look at 1996, and between 1996 and 1998, when you have these first bands that are then being produced. And the production idea came really from Japan, and it borrowed bits from America as well, so the idea of having a boy band or a girl band and then producing them. At this point, I know the Korean government takes quite a lot of credit for the for the spread of Hallyu. And it's true that as soon as it started really picking up, they did provide a lot of support in terms of tax cuts and helping out in various other ways in promoting Korean pop culture. But at the beginning, it was really just few people who were quite entrepreneurial and forward-looking, and kind of were looking at the domestic Korean market. And the first big band that really hit it big was called G.O.D, which, of course, you'd think spells God, but it's actually groove overdose. So this band just hit it massive. So it became another teenage phenomenon, and it sold a lot of I think CDs at that point, and teenagers are so good at getting what they want. So at this point then, Korea's GDP is quite high. There's a high level of employment. People have a lot of money to spend, especially teenagers. So you have this generation now who, they live in this democratic society. There is a lot of free time. You go to university, got nothing to worry about. And then the Asian financial crisis hits. And that becomes a big turning point in Korea's kind of entertainment industry, because suddenly there's a lot of unemployment. This is a really big, it's catastrophe. I was in Korea when it happened. And the mass employment, unemployment, and especially for young people, suddenly the rules have changed.
Did the material change in terms of what the bands were writing about, if they still existed?
Yeah, well, there were more bands, certainly, because they were still selling, because people want to escape, reality. And but the CD sales, they really dropped because people had less money. But around this time, then you have other things coming up. So mobile phones, for example. So what the companies very quickly realized that you could do things like, have file sharing. It starts becoming a thing. The problem was that you could do that illegally. So you can file share illegally. And at this point, it starts going overseas as well, to China and other places. So this is where the kind of globalization of Korean music starts really take place. It starts actually quite illegally. So there's file sharing, and that, of course, then impacts things like CD sales. But then they think, okay, maybe we can have hook ringtones. So ringtones you could start then selling, and you could download these, and it's, a couple of dollars a pop. So then you find that around this time, a lot of the songs actually have what we call a hook, which could then become a ringtone as well, and you could distinguish your ringtone. So what you have increasingly appearing are these sort of consumer sort of things that you can add, like that personalize your phone or...
Would it be fair to say that the technology was starting to influence the way music was being written?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And also, things like performances, live performances, people going to listen and fan products. And then the fan movement itself becomes a little bit more organized. So now we have BTS, of course, and we have BTS Army. So if we skip 20 years forward, this is in the kind of early 2000s. You start getting quite organized fandoms. They self-organize, and they start having quite a lot of influence also in what becomes popular, or they also start supporting the artists. So there are a few cases where management companies which are producing these bands, right? They try to, for example, sack a band member, but then the fans.
There's uproar.
There's an uproar
in the streets.
And suddenly you have this kind of, it's not just the management company or the production company and the managers and the band, which is often produced band, trained from early age and in various kind of art forms and foreign languages and even how to pose.
and combinations are put together with complementary skill sets and talents, yeah?
Yeah. Absolutely, and this one this kind of approach starts quite early. So in 1990s, that it borrows from the Japanese idol system, but then it becomes a really sort of its own Korean format as time goes onwards. And now, of course, it's an industry in its own right. It can be very problematic today. But in those days, it was interestingly the fans that would then often stand up for the artists in those early days. And then as the file sharing and internet starts getting faster, suddenly Hallyu or Korean wave becomes quite big in China. And that really is the start.
Just a small market, really, isn't it?
Just China? A small market. So it really helps to capture a small market like China. And China, of course, there's a lot of more sort of it's opening up. There's a lot of interest. Korean pop culture is something that is really appealing to a lot of people who might otherwise have an issue with American pop culture, right? So, it really appealed to Southeast Asian markets as well very quickly. And as soon as you get into that fandom movement, and this is where we actually see a big uptick in Korean pop culture, and its uptake is sort of in Europe or Australia or UK or US in 2000s. There will be some people who know something about Korean pop culture, right? But it's very small. Yeah. And it tends to be second generation kind of Asian Australian or Asian American or what have you. But in sort of from sort of 2010s onwards, I think what you really start seeing is internet is really fast. YouTube becomes really an important way of, and the videos become more interesting. And then it's really appealing music. And then you have the fandoms. So Blackpink has its own fandom, BTS obviously has got a very famous fandom, which is called BTS Army, and so forth. So those places then become places of belonging as well.
Look, there are so many avenues we need to go down, and I'm going to try and work through them. This is an incredible potted history of the growth of Hallyu globally. But initially, you said that the government of South Korea was, I guess, encouraging a cultural push.
Yeah.
Did this in any way resemble? Does this resemble what they had envisaged back in the early 90s? Does it look anything like they would have thought it could shape up as?
That's hard to say because I wasn't there in the government that time, but I would imagine that it didn't. So the idea was that Korea was going to be a bit like Italy in a way that it would showcase its high culture. So, you had Korea Foundation, which is a Korean, it sits under Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Yeah. And it was sort of modeled a little bit after, organizations like Japan Foundation, which really pushed for things like tea ceremonies and kind of traditional culture, right? So there is that showcasing. So every country wants to showcase their traditional, what we call sometimes authentic culture, or something that has been around for a long time.
Such a loaded word, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I just sort of rolled my eyes there when I said authentic. But the idea was really that it was going to be about design, maybe food, and so forth. But I don't think anyone expected this kind of K-pop, because of course K-pop in itself is a quite tricky one, because it's got that K dash, so you sort of associate it with Korea, but it kind of takes life of its own, so it's quite difficult to control. So for example, we can take the incident with Trump's, when Donald Trump was organizing a rally, and this was around the time when there was the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement. And the K-pop fans, BTS fans in particular, didn't like this idea of having a Trump rally. So they basically took over it, and they booked a lot of tickets to this rally.
I remember that. That was amazing.
And so this is very awkward for Korean governments, because, of course, America is a big partner, an important strategic ally. So I can just only imagine, of course I wasn't there and I don't have any evidence, but I can only imagine that there were a few sweaty palms when they read about this, or found out that these K-pop, so K-dash as in Korean pop fans, So there were some American Republican kind of hardliners who felt that this was Koreans doing something, of course, but
officially,
of course, fans who were fans of Korean culture rather than Korean people.
Oh, it was a haven for conspiracy theorists. One thing that's apparent through your potted history of Hallyu and K-pop within that is the importance of timing in the way that it's been able to grow and evolve. Would you agree with that? It's been a confluence of many factors, including the adoption and the development of technology in line with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very serendipitous in many ways, right? So you have not only Korean domestic industries and production companies and talent, which is really high. So let's not forget that either. That the artists are actually very talented, and they are picked from early age, and they're highly trained. And it's very difficult to become a K-pop star, right? You have to actually be at the top of your game. But then there's, of course, the issue of you have the technology to spread this, and then you have the ability of create online communities. And then even COVID worked in favor of K-pop movements, because, people are stuck at home, they're looking for something to belong to, people feel very isolated. So what we actually see that during COVID, a lot of these fandoms grow, and people find places of online belonging which feel very real. And then as restrictions lift, they go to see these bands live. And then you have local chapters. So like, for example, in Perth, we have local BTS Army chapter. Each bigger city would have one. And so I don't, of course, know how often they meet and so forth. But there is a local and global presence, which is quite exciting. So I'm really interested in K-pop fandoms, because for a sociologist, they're so interesting that you have an online virtual site of belonging, which is very real, sometimes even more real than, I don't know, your school friends, for example. But it's not just younger fans, it's also many people in their 60s,
right,
70s. There's also granny fans, so you can look online, the people knitting BTS.
There's an inclusivity about it.
Very much. And I think that's been one of the things that is also a point of pride for a lot of these fan groups, that they feel that they're very diverse. So, for example, in the US, many African Americans, they feel very included and welcome to these groups. And you have, for example, in some Southeast Asian countries, you have cover bands who do sort of dancing, K-pop dancing, and they have their own fandoms as well. So it's sort of, you don't really need to have money to be a fan You just need access to internet. And then so even things like going to watch them live. I mean, that's really expensive. So say if you wanted to go and see BTS or Blackpink live in Melbourne, that'll set you back for quite a few $100s, right?
Yeah.
But if you have a cover band who's doing just the dance moves on the streets of, I don't know, somewhere in Thailand or Cambodia or something, you don't really have to spend that much money. You can just enjoy it like a flash mob and, do that sort of thing. So particularly the kind of K-pop dancing as well. It's very easy to enter. You don't have to do any dance training. You can just go and enjoy. So it's kind of, K-pop is super interesting because it's not necessarily always about Korea or Korean culture, but it can become very localized around this idea of Korean culture, which it may or may not have anything to do with actual Korean culture or Korean society.
And an approximation.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, look. A couple of years ago, when I sat there at my daughter's year 3 school song and dance recital, and I saw them singing and dancing to BTS, I knew that it had gone full circle. It was here. We were listening and watching K-pop in the back blocks of suburban Perth. I mean, it was just demonstrated in full effect for me. What I want to know from you is, what about film? What is the current shape of Korean film? How would you describe it as a genre? What are the hallmarks?
Can I go back to that point though? Because sorry,
Sure, absolutely, please.
Because that Perth, having Korean pop culture playing in Perth, like, I agree with you. I think it's one of the most interesting and exciting cultural phenomenon in today's pop culture, because it not only is this all in Korean and then you have maybe some English thrown in these songs. It's very catchy, and there's this whole thing about how authentic it is, right? Is it just a copy of American pop culture? But we all know that pop culture is just this mishmash of, you go wherever you want to go, and you kind of, it's whatever sort of catches the audience of whoever is listening. But it's incredible that Korea, perhaps because a lot of people don't have preconceived ideas about what Korea might be like. If you're a bit older, you might think Korean War, or you might think North Korea. But kind of K-pop is imagined, it's become this imagined, kind of very neutral space that people can imagine and consume whichever way they like. And that's why it's quite...
It's open, and it's without open. Restriction.
That's right. And you don't feel like you have to have some kind of, like, if you like, I don't know, Avengers or American pop culture, you feel like you have to somehow approve of America as a nation, right? So for a lot of countries, like, I don't know, if you're in Middle East, for example, K-pop is really safe thing to consume because it's just Korea, right? Chinese pop culture is really interesting.
Yeah.
But and Japanese too. But it for some it may come with kind of a baggage.
There's no subversive risk or perceived subversive risk to attaching yourself to K-pop.
Yeah, and I think this is where Korean government has been quite clever, and they've taken a huge risk as well, is that when they then sell Korea to tourists, they use these phrases like, imagine your Korea. So, you come and you imagine what you want Korea to be, but it's very vibrant and, it's got these lively aspects to it, and you too can be part of Korea's story. So you feel that you're included in it rather than just observing from afar. So I think that's what's really made Korean pop culture so popular, is that it's so inclusive. It feels safe, and it's accessible to even kids in Perth.
Well, Associate Professor Jo Halfing Hwang, can we look at that from a South Korean perspective? Yes. Is there such thing as a Hallyu purist? What is the view back in South Korea about how it's evolving globally and how it's being consumed?
I don't think anyone does pop culture and thinks anything is pure. So I think it's really interesting that I've read some media commentary about K-pop, and there's been some criticism that it's just copying, it's inauthentic, it's copying American pop culture. And just like we talked earlier, this whole issue of authenticity in K-pop, I think is just something that it's a non-conversation really, because all culture is inauthentic in some ways. Now, of course, there may be some people who are a little bit worried about what's happening to traditional Korean culture. Is traditional Korean culture going to be somehow forgotten, or is it going to subsume? But what we actually find is that you have what we call kugak, kuk means country and ak is music. So you have the traditional Korean music, and that's actually got a little bit of a boost out of this as well. It still needs a lot of support from government, of course, because it's not mainstream in Korea either. Korean kids listen to K-pop as well, and Taylor Swift. Swift and all of that. But traditional music, for example, it takes a lot of training. Traditional pansori singing, it takes a lot of training. All of these sort of outdoor theatre forms like mass dance, they are being supported. And a lot of foreigners, actually, if you go to, for example, as an exchange student, if you wanted to go to Korea, you can probably join a university club and get a little bit of a feel of what it's like. There is a very strong kind of policy and legislation behind trying to protect what is seen as cultural heritage, and particularly intangible cultural heritage. So there is probably very little worry about, whether K-pop itself is going to somehow affect the sort of intangible heritage of Korea. The worry is more it's very similar to Australia. Is there enough funding for the arts?
Sure.
So it's very similar because it's not mainstream and not everybody sits at home and listens to traditional pansori singing. So the markets are much smaller.
But from a Hallyu perspective, because it seems to be so, it doesn't take a specific shape necessarily. Are you saying that back in South Korea, there are no hard and fast rules that need to be adhered to be considered part of Hallyu or to be considered authentic K-pop? The fact that it's evolving is very much accepted at home as well.
Oh yeah, well, people are very proud of the fact that K-pop has made it big. It's seen as a commercial product, but that's where you also then find that you have the so-called real musicians, who do sort of, underground music. Korean punk is really it's so good. And there are so many different kinds of, hybrid music forms that have sort of evolved using traditional Korean instruments. So like Jambinai, for example, who were in Perth a couple of years back, they do this sort of post-rock where they use traditional instruments and then they use sort of heavy metal influences and rock and lights and things. So it's a very, when you sit in the audience, you feel it.
So it's a Sigur Rós of South Korean music.
Yeah, and there's many of them. So it's so the non-K-pop Korean music scene is vibrant. It's really exciting. Very exciting, but it's not known. So this is, I think, one of my personal regrets is that a lot of people know about K-pop, and that's commercial, and it's made for commercial purposes, and it makes a lot of money for the GDP.
But there's so much more.
There's so much more. So as a scholar of Korean studies and also someone who teaches at university in Korean studies, my hope is always, like when I teach Korean pop culture here at Curtin, for example, what we want to do is we talk about K-pop, but we also want to introduce students to these other forms of Korean pop culture, including,
film,
TV series, film.
Talk to me about film.
Oh, film.
Where are we at with South Korean film? Is there a favouring towards a certain genre that we'd recognise as, horror or rom-com or? Far away.
Yeah, there's all sorts, and it depends what it's produced for. So Netflix has really changed the game in Korea. So, say, for example, so you have film and then you have TV series. So TV series are these kinds of soaps or comedies and so forth, and they typically have about like 16 episodes, and they have a lot of cliffhangers, and they are very easily consumable, and they're super popular overseas. And then you have the Korean film, which is more, so you usually don't have film directors who then do TV directing, or film, so directors or script writers who would then also do TV series. So it's like a very divided.
Still very siloed at this
Very
stage.
siloed. But with Netflix, what's happened is Netflix has now opened up an opportunity, because it's not produced by Korean broadcasting companies. A lot of the films and TV series are something between. So Korean films tend to be quite, they focus very much on the visual landscape, so it's very much about, not so much about the narrative, but it's very much about how the film makes you feel. So if you watch Korean movies, you're often left quite disturbed at the end of it. So either because there's a lot of blood or gruesome murders, or something really unexpected happens, like the main character just dies.
We'll spoil it.
Far too early somehow. And so, or the ending is somehow open. And this is a really traditional Korean narrative structure, that you don't have clear conclusion. So Western storytelling tends to have a clear plot and a kind of hero's journey. But Korean storytelling is more, I guess, Taoist in a sense. There's got no beginning and end. It is very much about how the narrative makes you feel, or the visuals make you feel. So you try to, as a director, you try to kind of evoke some kind of response from the audiences. So as such, it doesn't make it very easily consumable. So you never go and see a Korean movie and think, oh, this is going to be fun and easy to watch. You're kind of going there thinking, oh, how am I going to be challenged this time? So if you want to have the fun and sort of, oh, this was a hard day, I need some light entertainment, just any TV drama. Go for it. Knock yourself out, and you probably feel uplifted because everyone lives.
What did the success of Parasite mean to the film industry?
Oh, that was so important. So for Korean government especially, that kind of international recognition has been very important. And, when you're a divided country, you have North and South, it's not just about legitimacy of which Korea is more legitimate, right? It's also about, like, Korea was so poor in 1950s. It was completely destroyed by the war. It was seen as the basket case of all countries in the world. It was one of the poorest countries in the world. And it was, people were, really super poor. And now it's only 70-something years, 80, what is it now?
Time's flying.
Time is flying. Right. 70-something years later, 75 years later, and now we have, one of the leading economies, Australia's top 3 trading partner, that is leading the way in innovating cultural, global cultural sort of innovations in film, thinking about. So a lot of the Korean film directors, for example, of course, they get a lot of influences from the sort of film theories and famous directors like Hitchcock and so forth in the West, if you like, but also in Japan. And in China and other places, but they are also always experimenting because they have developed their own style. So when you watch, that's right.
Visual language.
Visual language is but it is very kind of noir-esque, and it is very often quite dark.
Yeah.
And if it's comedy, it's very Korean comedy. So it doesn't. You have to kind of understand Korean sense of humor to get the comedy. So, for example, my brother is a cinematographer, and he doesn't understand Korean comedy at all. He doesn't find it funny. I find it hilarious.
You've had the benefit of many years.
Yeah. I speak Korean, so it's. I find it absolutely hilarious.
You hinted at well, in fact, you stated quite unequivocally that that it's been economically such an important boon for the ongoing success and revitalisation of South Korea's economy over the last 70 or so years. And we tend to, in the mainstream, look at South Korea as a great exporter of electronic consumer goods and cars. But in terms of its culture, Hallyu, what is the dollar value? Is it comparable to those other exports now?
Pretty much. I mean, you can even look at, I should really look it up, the dollar value of just BTS is immense. So you are talking a significant chunk of Korea's GDP. And to be honest, I didn't really check what these last year's figures were, so I'd have to go and have a look at them. But we can safely say that it is a significant enough a chunk of Korea's GDP. Of course, it brings in a lot of things like tourism, and that's a very important thing. But it's also things like selling cultural sort of products and different formats, TV formats. Koreans are really good at coming up with TV formats that then they sell on to hard-to-get markets like China. And also co-producing a lot of international collaborations and things like that. So you see bands like Coldplay, for example, doing a collaboration with BTS. I mean, that immediately, it's not just Coldplay that sells out of that, it's BTS as well. So all of that is income to Korea's, gross national product, if you like. So Korea does have its own appointments, and if not ministry, but it has its own office that looks after Korean pop culture, and it's a ministerial appointment. So it's a high-level appointment. So that's how seriously Korean government takes this industry. So they really have the producer's corner.
I imagine that everybody in that office looks amazing.
I think misconception, I like that though. But if you're a minister, you have to look ministerial and not like a K-pop star. Otherwise, no one's going to take you seriously. It's pushed the boundaries of how does government, what role does government play in supporting the arts? Korea itself has got still obviously lots to do with supporting traditional arts. They do heavily. But I think it does. I mean, I wish actually that Australian government would sort of look a bit more at what the film industry has done in Korea, for example, is that you're either all in or all out kind of thing these days. And also just, I think what's really exciting about Korean, say, film industry is that they're very brave, and they don't really care about, I mean, everyone wants to win prizes, but they still do their own thing. And then, so you create quite unique, exciting spectacles in that way. But if you're really then making, so TV series, again, totally different thing. Commercial product, you want to appease the audiences. So maybe that's part of it, is that they have such clear two sides to the entertainment industry. And then there's the Netflix, which is kind of place where everything meets.
Yes, the great global viewing marketplace, so to speak.
That's right.
Look, I don't know if this is in your wheelhouse, but I want to look at the effect of Hallyu and K-pop within the South Korean idiom, and particularly what is it like growing up in South Korea now? When I was in South Korea in the late 2000s, there were a couple of things that really stood out to me at the time. And that was the emphasis on technology and how important a part that played already back then. The access to high-speed public internet was phenomenal. It was faster already then than what I'm receiving at home from my internet service provider in 2023. It's incredible. The government-funded initiatives like starting cities from scratch, like Incheon. The ability to sort of look forward and concentrate on the future for the next generation, was very much a part of being South Korean. The other thing I noticed at the time was that was the first place I'd seen selfie sticks become such a massive thing. That was a good couple of years before it became a thing in Australia.
Yeah.
And so everybody, we saw for the first time the notion of inserting yourself into the backdrop and making your experience of the place that you're at, making sure that everybody knows that you're part of that experience and that you were there and that you were having a good time. Is there, I guess what I'm trying to ask, is there an inordinate pressure since then that K-pop and Hallyu has brought about in terms of being young in South Korea? Do you have to be a certain way because of, I guess, how pervasive this culture has become within South Korea, not just globally?
Yeah, I think that overlaps a little bit with beauty cultures, I guess. But on the other hand, K-pop style itself is again a style that is produced for the stage. So even though you have K-pop stars who look amazing and they have dyed hair and they probably have surgery in many cases and so forth, that is the K-pop aesthetic. So if you're, I don't know, a guy who's in their 50s working in a company, those kinds of aesthetics are really irrelevant to you. But for younger people, of course, just like in Australia, the world is much more visual these days. And it's perhaps more to do with selfies, and it's more to do with the appearing culture online. Just what you were talking about there, you have to be seen to be doing things in order to almost exist. Or, if you didn't take a selfie and post it on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, then it didn't happen. There's no evidence that you've been in this amazing place. So with that, you also, of course, then have to be, you have to look selfie ready, or you have to use, so for example, I think Korean Samsung phones were some of the first ones that introduced a kind of beauty filter.
Yeah, that's
so, you quite often see people posting selfies, and you can see that there's a beauty filter that's been used, and just the thing. So it can be quite panoptic, if you like. It can be quite hard for particularly young people to live in that kind of hypervisual. So if you have any kind of issue with your face, for example, or your appearance, it can be quite difficult not to do anything about it. But that doesn't mean that everybody does. And there is a kind of anti-appearances movement as well, where women in particular, refuse to use makeup. But then there's also a strong focus on playing the part. So Irving Goffman, who's a famous sociologist, talks about front stage and backstage. And Korean culture is very, there are quite clearly defined sort of rules on, how to be part of the in-group. So, for example, if you work in a Samsung company, there is a Samsung way of wearing clothes, right? Even companies have got their own sort of dress codes. So if you're a young guy working for Samsung, you're probably expected to also ensure that you go to the gym and look fit.
Because Samsung chic, yeah.
Yeah, well, pretty much. But then again, if you're a professor working at Seoul National University, you don't want to look completely haggard, but you don't want to look like a K-pop star either, because, no one takes you seriously. So it just depends on the context. So if you're in a public-facing job, I don't know, work in a cafe, then for sure, you have to look after yourself. But it's also part of it is that Korean skincare products are really amazing. They are cheap. So it's the access also to services that make you look glowing are much cheaper, I can attest you. So some things that are very expensive, say in Australia, because people don't really engage with those practices and opportunities to enhance your appearance, are much cheaper and more available in Korea. So personally, I would say why not? As long as it doesn't become obviously an issue.
Look,
It's a cultural difference.
Well, for a 92-year-old, you look fantastic.
Oh, thanks so much.
Associate Professor Elfing Huang, as an expert in Korean studies, and this is to round us up, what do you see in the future for Hallyu and K-pop in particular? Do you see it taking shape in a certain way? What are you noticing now?
So I think it's going to evolve. One of the things that I love about Korean culture, whether it's pop culture or whether it's Korean heritage, is that it always surprises you. So what form it will take, there is not knowing. But there is so much focus on promoting and supporting creativity, creative industries in Korea. There is a really, that Korea ranks really high in maths and literacy. Also pays a lot of attention in education, which is quite harsh education sometimes and heavy education, but there's a heavy emphasis also on creativity. And so a lot of Korean young people choose to go self-employed as well. And they look for opportunities in that area. So creative arts is something that, and particularly in these kinds of digital arts, is a really growing industry. So I would just say, watch this space. I don't think Hallyu or Korean wave or Korean pop culture is going anywhere. Now that it's become known and people seek it out, regardless of age, so there are a lot of people who stumble across Korean pop culture in their 40s, 50s, 60s, get hooked, and then they look for more. So one of the warnings I guess I need to leave with your listeners is that watch out for Korean TV series. Once you start watching them, you get hooked. And same might happen with K-pop. If you get involved in fandoms and things, you might get hooked regardless of your age or gender or orientation. But I'm excited for Korea's pop culture going forward because what's coming around the corner, no one knows, but I'm sure it'll be exciting.
It's an endlessly fertile pasture for you to keep, I guess, examining and studying and talking to us about well into the future.
Exactly.
Associate Professor Elfing Huang, thank you so much for spending some time with us today and opening up a world for a lot of us and an insight into Hallyu and K-pop. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, and don't forget to sign up for Korean studies classes at Curtin.
You've been listening to The Future Of, a podcast powered by Curtin University. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it. And if you want to hear more from experts, stay up to date by subscribing to us on your favourite podcast app. Bye for now.